For the rest of this repair video now, we're going to focus on the control and the base assembly, which is what we've got before us here. We're going to start out by removing the pneumatic cylinder from the control body, and that will separate the whole control assembly from the base assembly. To do that, we're going to set the control on its side. And I'm going to use a pair of channel locks. I'm going to clamp down on this pneumatic cylinder and twist it, and that will break loose the taper lock fit that's up here, and the two halves will separate. This can be done with either channel locks. We've done some with pipe wrenches, or maybe a big pair of vice grips. Okay, that was a chair that's been tested. This wasn't just a prop we set up. So the taper fit was locked together pretty good, and you see how easy it came apart. I want to point out now this wrench, or the channel locks, have left marks on the top of that pneumatic cylinder. We're not going to be able to reuse that. And that's typical. If you're taking the pneumatic cylinder apart from the control body, it's probably damaged, and you're not going to want to use it again anyways. Now we're going to go through the assembly of the base. The key components here are the large molded base itself. Each base has 5 casters. The casters just snap into sockets on the underside. We've also got a cartridge type pneumatic cylinder. This includes the pneumatic cylinder and the hub tube. And we've got an upper and lower cover. First, Rich is going to install a caster. The casters just snap into the hole that's molded in the underside of the base. You're going to find these casters go in easier than a lot of our product, so this will go pretty smooth. Once the casters are in, he's flipping the base over, and he's going to insert the pneumatic cylinder assembly. He's putting it in and just twisting it slightly, pushing down to seat it by hand. When the user is in the chair, his body weight will seat the cylinder the rest of the way. Now he's installing the top cover. That's just a friction fit over the top part of the hub tube there. He'll tap that down into place. And then install the lower cover. There are notches cut in the upper part of that cover that line up with ribs molded in the underside of the base. And once that's started and all lined up, he'll tap that down with a hammer also. Disassembling the base is just the reverse procedure. Typically, once a user's been in the chair for a while, that cylinder assembly will have to be driven out with a hammer. And there he's showing how the base assembly inserts into the control. Now we're going to tear down the control assembly. The first step is the removal of the rod and the bearings on the rear of the upright. I want to point out here, this control was designed using a lot of the components from the Improv and Improv HE controls, so you're going to see a lot of similarity here. Rich used a screwdriver there to separate the two halves of the cover, and he'll remove those. Once it's separated, the top half just lifts off. The lower half you need to pull rearward and down, and the features will separate, and that'll drop out of the way. Now to separate the upright from the control body, he's taking the tension adjustment shaft and loosening that up and removing it. He's using a wrench to hold that top jam nut while he's turning the handle underneath. And he's doing two things here. He's removing the jam nut and also removing the tension from the spring assembly. While you're doing this, you want to make sure that the upright is in the full forward or forward tilted position. That will put less preload on the springs. Okay, in his hand there, he's got the threaded shaft with the knob screwed on it. There's a plastic bearing on the lower part of that shaft. That needs to be greased. That reduces friction from the assembly while you're adjusting tension. Now we need to remove the center tube that goes through the chair. We're just using a 1/2-inch socket extension here to remove that. He's putting that against the end of the shaft inside of that button, and he'll tap on that, and that'll separate the pieces. And you can see the button came off of this side, and now on the back side, that's the connector that goes through the tube that holds the tube from sliding out. And now he can pull the steel tube out. Let's spin the controller around so they can see the steel tube. That comes out, and now he'll remove the 2 spring bearings just by lifting up and pulling out on each of those. Notice that these components are greased. When this is reassembled, we need to make sure there's a grease on there to keep the chair from squeaking. Once the 2 bearings are out, now the whole upright assembly will lift away and separate from the control. Looking at the control now, we've got 2 torsion springs, very similar to Improv HE. The same body is used. That should look familiar. We've got a new system in there for pneumatic activation, and we want to talk through disassembly of that now. This model right here has a extra component that's screwed on, and Rich is removing that right now. Later versions of this mechanism will not have the little strap that's seen there with a screw on it. They'll be installed and assembled entirely with snap fits.
Got one of those. You can show them there.
Now the mechanism is made up of a steel rod. There's a steel plate in there that hooks into the control and actually pushes down on the top of the pneumatic cylinder. And there's a large plastic part we refer to as a pneumatic bearing. That ties everything together, provides some plastic bearing surfaces. And that's the component that he's driving apart right now. He's just separated the snap fits between the plastic part and the steel part.
Now take this.
Okay. He's lifting the steel bracket off of the rod, and now the rod can be dropped out the bottom of the control body. Now we're going to install the pneumatic mechanism in the control body. I want to point out here that there's an area on the spindle bracket that needs to be greased. This is where the tab on the end of the stamped part rests. We want to make sure there's grease on that interface. Now Rich is inserting the rod up through the bottom of the control body, and he snakes it through, and now he is putting the steel stamping over the end of the rod and positioning it so that the tab sticking out of the left side of it there drops through the window and locks into that spindle bracket. In this view, we've got all 3 components in the correct orientation. Now he's going to push the plastic bearing and the end of the rod down against the steel stamping and then slide the bearing to the left to engage the snap features. If this won't go by hand, you can use a pair of pliers to push against them. There you heard the features snap into place. Now there are 2 sets of snap features that need to be engaged. We need to verify that. On the end of the part, there's a small finger that extends out on each side of the rod. That's being pushed down and snapped into place to make sure the rod doesn't rattle side to side. Also, about midpoint up there, halfway up the stamping, there's a small wall, and there's a cantilevered finger on each side of the bearing that needs to snap down behind that wall. Now, with this device, activation is accomplished by pulling up on the lever. The mechanism will not activate if the lever is pushed downward. That completes pneumatic. Now we're going to complete the final assembly of the control body and the upright assembly. There, Rich is setting the torsion springs in place. At this point, there are two plastic parts on the back edge of the control body. We call them bumpers. We need to verify that those are in place. Also notice that they're greased. The inside of the torsion springs are greased also to cut down on noise. Now he's sliding the upright on over the rear leg of the torsion springs, and he will install the spring bearing on each side. That's inserted through the big window on the side of the upright, on through the body, and then into the body of the torsion spring. On the outside of the bearings, there's a little step that sets over the lower surface of that hole in the side of the upright bracket. That engagement is part of what keeps those bearings from sliding out. Here he's making sure that the rear leg of the torsion spring is nested between those dimples that are pushed in the top of the upright. Those help maintain the spring position. Now he's going to slide the upright tube through the bearings, and he's pulling up on the back side of it there to help guide it through the hole. And he slid that in until it's roughly flush with the outside edge of the bearings. Now, to keep that tube from sliding out, there's a set of parts we call the retainers. And he's sliding the retainer with a button already inserted on one end through the tube, and now he's going to put the button on this side of it. Now, because of the length of the components, they won't engage correctly unless that center shaft is pushed towards the screen here. He's going to do that with a 1/2-inch socket extension. And on the front here, why don't you show them what you're doing with that? Yeah, what he's doing on the back side is he's putting the end of the extension into that button and holding the shaft towards the button over here that he's going to install. When you do that, there should be a definite audible click that will tell you that that button is snapped in place. Now he's ready to install the tension adjustment components. To make this easier to do, he's going to hold the upright in the normal chair position and then engage the tilt lock. The tilt lock is engaged right now. There, he rotated the lever to the normal use position. Now he's rotating it back to the locked position, and that will hold the upright in place while he's assembling the tension adjustment device. Again, here there's a small plastic bearing, a little crescent-shaped bearing, on the very bottom of that shaft. We need to make sure that's in place and that it has grease on it. Also, the threaded shaft should have grease on it. Those two things working together will cut down on friction. Now he's inserted the shaft up through the hole in the control body between the springs. He's set the little steel stamping over the ends of the springs and positioning the square nut down in that stamping, tightening it down. And now he's got just a little bit of tension on that. We want to go back and make sure that the rear spring legs are still in position between those dimples. Now that everything's centered, we're going to put on the washer with a D-shaped hole that goes down on the top of the shaft. And he's going to start the jam nut. And he's holding the jam nut with a wrench and just tightening down the tension knob. He's going to reach a point where that D-shaped washer stops against a step on that threaded shaft, and then the jam nut will go against that washer and everything will jam up tight. And that's what keeps the user from backing the tension adjustment all the way off and having the components come out of position. Now, before we put on the upright covers, we're going to flip this over and talk for a minute about the tilt lock function. We're going to briefly go through the operation of the tilt lock and forward tilt mechanisms. We're showing this upside down. It's the best way to get a good view of what's going on in there. Right now, I've got the tilt lock lever oriented in the centermost position. When I'm in the centermost position and try to recline the chair, it reclines and comes to the normal front stop position. At this point, I've just got a normal desk chair. If I rotate the lever forward now, and because we're upside down, it looks like I'm going rearward, I've rotated to the forward tilt position, and this finger has moved and put a slight preload on this wire spring. And now when I recline, this front stop is pivoted out of position, and when I come back up, you can see the chair has gone farther forward. That's in forward tilt mode right there. If I rotate the lever back to the mid position and then recline the chair, the pivoting front stop is moved back into position, and now the chair stops at the nominal chair position, so I'm in normal chair mode again. Lastly now, if I rotate the lever rearward to the lock position, I've driven this lock plate against the back of the control body, and it's meshed with that now so that when I try to recline, it won't move. There I'm back in normal chair mode. If I go to forward tilt mode and then rotate the lever to the locked position, you can see the plate has come back in there, and now I'm locked so I can't recline out of forward tilt position. Taking this back to the nominal chair position in the center, once I recline, everything moves back into position and I have normal chair function. If you're working on a chair that doesn't have the tilt lock and forward tilt options, you'll have an upright that looks more like this without all of these components back in this area. However, this option, the option without tilt lock and forward tilt, requires the use of this stop. There will be two of these parts. One goes on each side of the upright, and this part is installed by putting it under this tab and then pushing it upward so that the lock feature comes through the hole. That's all that holds it in place. There will be one here, identical component on the other side. This is what replaces the tilt lock and forward tilt mechanism. We're going to complete the assembly of the control and upright by installing the rear covers. Rich is going to install the lower cover first. On the lower cover, about halfway up, there are two pins that extend out. Those pins go through mating holes in the upright. On the front of the plastic cover, there are a couple little box sections. The horizontal wall on those will engage with a mating feature on the upright. Right there, Rich is pointing to the hole. That's the hole that lines up with the pins. And then up towards the front of the upright, there's a little horizontal notch cut out that mates with the feature on the front of the cover. So now he's lining all those features up, and then he'll slide the cover forward to engage those. Now the top part of the cover can be installed. On the underside of that cover, there are a pair of cantilevered snap features on each side. Those open up and surround that pin that we just pointed out a few minutes ago, and that helps lock the cover in place.
These tabs go over.
Okay, so he's got the cover oriented in the correct place, and now he's pushing down, and those snap in place. Now on the front of that cover, there are two little cantilevered springs that rest on the top of that upright plate, on the top of the tilt lock plate. Need to make sure that those fingers are resting on top of the bends and not interfering with the motion of that plate. Now the rod can be installed by inserting it through those flanges that are bent up on the stamping. Notice that there's a cradle molded into the top cover. And now the plastic bearings are inserted on each end of the rod. And they're pushed in until they mesh with those flanges, and that's what holds them in place. And that's it.